And I know that I eat emotionally, but I never wanted to ride around in a minivan on dope or alcohol with little children in the car. I didn't want to drink whiskey. So my kids would get to fighting and my husband would say something hateful like, "What have you done all day?" And that would make me so mad, and I'd eat a hot dog, and I didn't even know what happened. But Weight Watchers has a point system. So say you get like 23 points out of the day, and you got to go within those points, and they'll say, "Fruits and vegetables are free." You don't want fruits and vegetables. When you first start, you're so hungry that you could eat the wallpaper off the wall. A chicken breast is 3 points. A Snicker bar is 12 points. That's what you want. I've been known to be in the closet turning a lamp on and off, eating a sleeve of Chips Ahoy cookies. But I try to stay within my points. All right, my sister will go on it every time I will, and she lives in Clarksville, Tennessee, and she'll call me and she'll say, "It's noon, and I've eaten all my points."
Good morning. It's Wednesday, Apollo Wednesday, December the 24th, Christmas Eve, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Varney and Company, motivation, meditation, and Apollo. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. The end of Maria Bartiromo and the beginning of Varney and Company.
The Santa Claus house in North Pole, Alaska. Many reviews say the experience is overpriced and limited in scope, but I still think that's interesting to go to the North Pole. Then the Ogilvy Park Festival of Lights, Wheeling in West Virginia. Visitors were unhappy about the long wait times to enter the park and also the lackluster light display. Then there's Lights Under Louisville in Kentucky. Complaints also centered on long wait times and disappointment with the display. And finally, the Christ Kindle Market in Bethlehem in Pennsylvania, where multiple reviewers pointed to high entry fees, crowded walkways, and the cost of food and merchandise. Well, it just sounds like a lot of bah humbug to me. Michael, your thoughts? I mean, nobody wants to spend a lot of money and wait on long lines. I get it, but you didn't have to go either.
Yeah. So this is the perfect case where the wish of having a great Christmas experience meets with the reality of lots of other people wanting to have that same wish.
Right.
And so for me, the best time was when the family together, the kids were small. Bring me the Polar Express. Yeah. That for me is Christmas.
And Jamie, North Pole in Alaska, that sounds like, just an experience to be there, even if there's a long line.
Well, first world problems. I mean, there's nothing more telling about a good economy than people complaining about attractions. So consumer sentiment is important. Everybody, when people are complaining, that means they're having fun.
Yeah, I was going to say that. If you're still paying the cost of entry and you're paying to get there, however you figured out your transportation, and you might be buying some overpriced hot chocolate as well, then that means things are pretty good. We are all blessed and very, very grateful. Michael Balboni and Jamie Cox, thank you so much for your time this morning. That's going to do it for us this morning. Varney and Company is up next. I'm going to hand it over to Ashley Webster in for Stu.
Indeed. Jackie, Merry Christmas to you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Of course, thank you. I indeed is Ashley Webster in for Stuart Varney. On this Christmas Eve, let's get right to it. It is a shortened trading day today on Wall Street. The market's actually closed today at 1 p.m. Eastern, but they are trading until then. And right now, the futures essentially flat. S&P and NASDAQ just on the upside. The Dow Jones on the downside. We've had 4 winning sessions in a row, so can we make it 5? Take a look at gold. Talk about winning, rising to an all-time high, above $4,500 per ounce, up another close to $12 at $45.16 for gold. On the show today, a new report from the White House Council of Economic Advisors, first shared with Fox Business, finds that inflation over the past year running lower in conservative states compared to liberal ones. We'll get into that. On Capitol Hill, Congress is on a break until 2026, but lawmakers are weighing a second budget reconciliation bill with an eye, of course, on the midterms. There is a setback for President Trump's immigration crackdown, the Supreme Court rejecting the administration's bid to deploy the National Guard to Illinois. And in a new podcast interview, Hunter Biden doesn't have a lot of kind words for his father's handling of the U.S. border with Mexico or his disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And our annual Christmas Eve tradition, Stuart's reading of 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. Look forward to that. It is December 24th. Merry Christmas Eve, everybody. Varney and Company about to begin.
And that was Ashley Webster and Nonprofit News Now. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit of motivation.
There's some necessary losses in life. When you decide acting in your best interest, you're going to lose some friends. Everybody's not going to approve of you. There's some people that won't like you. Who do you think you are? You're arrogant. What do you think you can do? You think you can get away with that? Come on, be real, man. Come on, get a life. You can't do that. You can't come back from that. People who should be there to help you won't help you. In fact, they will discourage you. They will laugh at you. Here you go again. All of that's going to be a part of it. And you are going to become independently wealthy. Right. They laugh. They're going to laugh at you. People are going to laugh at you. In fact, if you don't have any critics right now, if you're not controversial at all,
If you don't have any haters, if you don't have anybody putting you down or trying to pull you back or wondering what the heck's going on with you as you change, you're probably not doing anything great in your life. In fact, it's one of the leading indicators you're doing something.
They're only going to talk about you if you're building something.
You're doing something right. You got some critics. You're controversial.
It just means you're making a change.
So at some point, you have to decide you're okay with being misunderstood.
Crazy means that you have the ability to see things that other people can't. Anybody that's done something great, they don't think like anybody else. They can't. And the people that tell you you can't do it, you know what your response to them is? Watch me. That's all you have to say. Watch me.
It is impossible until some crazy scientist has the audacity to believe that no matter what the expert or the doctor says, I can still do this.
Remember these words by Frank Sinatra. The best revenge is massive success. Become massively successful. That's how you become even.
Don't give up. Don't give up on your dreams. Don't pick it back up. There's a dream you left 2-3 years ago. Somebody told you you couldn't do it, and you internalized that foolishness. Stop listening to the haters. Shut them down. Shut them up.
They're dream stealers. It's the people around you trying to project onto you their small worldview. They're settling.
The professor at Michigan State told me, you don't think critically enough to get a PhD. You can't write a dissertation. I'm like, ooh, I get it. Where you from, people are smart. Where I'm from, we grind. You want to shut your haters up? How do you do it? You do it by being successful. You don't do it by falling into their traps, doing what they want you to do, putting your head down. You don't do it by not being successful. Let me tell you what I learned. Nothing succeeds like success. Who cares what they say? Who cares what they think? Kill the noise. Shut them down. Pick your dream back up. Pick your goals back up. And you're going to prove that everybody that tried to break you, everybody that tried to stop you, everybody that tried to kill your dream, you're going to prove all of them wrong. Just grind and let your grind speak for you. We ain't got to tell them who we are. We just keep grinding and they going to figure it out. Keep grinding. Keep working. And that other stuff will take care of itself. Make them a believer.
The only difference between steam and ice is the state of vibration. Because when you start to get criticism, it's either going to change this ice where it gets colder and colder, or it's going to turn to steam because you heat up. You've got to use the criticism you're getting and the fact that you're misunderstood. And oftentimes being misunderstood by the people closest to you as fuel, as steam that heats you up to get after it, to just say, you will not steal my dream. Why are you changing? Why are you growing? Why isn't what we have good enough? Why can't you just be happy? It's not that I'm unhappy, it's that I'm addicted to the expansion of my being.
Were they right about what they said about you? You weren't going to be Were they right? Well, maybe you got a chance to prove them wrong right now. Who's betting against you right now? I want you to see emotion in that, and I want you to get pissed off, and I want you to prove them wrong.
You better be fucking pissed when people doubt you. You better learn how to take that pissed off energy and put it into productive action, because most people can't do that. They don't use it as a flip or a trigger or a pivot to make you go work. Every fucking negative comment should trigger you into productive action. Every time somebody says something to you, you should go do whatever it is that is going to make them have to eat their words. You should be thinking about and recalling all this that anybody ever told you about not becoming what it is you say you're going to become. Don't give in. Don't be like everybody else. Don't give up. Don't settle because things are hard. Don't let people talk you into their life. There's no fucking nobility in being broke and insignificant.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little meditation.
Welcome back to another day of our gratitude series. We do not walk this life alone. We are carried by countless unseen hands. People who show up every day so the world can keep moving. Take Take a gentle breath in and feel appreciation begin to rise. Allow your body to soften. Let your breath become steady and calm. Community lives in the small, consistent acts. Often unnoticed, always essential. Today, we honor those who serve. Bring to mind the people who supported your life this year. Perhaps healthcare workers caring for health and healing. Or cleaners keeping spaces safe. Even the delivery drivers, transport workers, service staff, neighbors, volunteers, community helpers. See their presence clearly. Let gratitude form gently in your chest. Notice how these people made your days easier. Through routine, through responsibility, through kindness, skill, and dedication. They carried parts of your life, so you didn't have to do everything alone. Breathe in appreciation. Breathe out thanks. Imagine gratitude flowing outward to hospitals, streets, buildings, homes. With each breath, affirm softly, I am grateful for those who serve. Their efforts support my life and my community. Feel respect and warmth fill your awareness. Community is care in motion. Carry this gratitude forward. In patience, kindness, and recognition. We rise together. Slowly return to this moment. When you're ready, reflect with this prompt. Who supported my daily life this year through service? And how can I honor them through gratitude or action? You may pause here to journal or carry this appreciation into your day. Thank you for being part of this shared world.
And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Apollo.
Chapter 27. You really need to understand that the CSM is dying. When Apollo 13 lifted off on April 11th, 1970, manned spaceflight was 1 day shy of the 9th anniversary of Gagarin's flight. In the intervening years, the actual flights had been unexpectedly safe. 37 times men had sat atop rockets and been blasted off into space. 36 times they had returned safely. Only once, if one discounted rumors of unacknowledged Russian catastrophes, had a flight resulted in a fatality. In April 1967, Vladimir Komarov of the Soviet Union had perished after his parachutes failed to deploy properly during an emergency entry. Of the 36 crews that had returned safely, the Americans had launched 22, 6 in Mercury, 10 in Gemini, 6 in Apollo. So, perhaps it was time for something to go wrong. Or perhaps Providence was rebuking the Apollo engineers for the sin of hubris. Or perhaps the superstitious were right and NASA was asking for it. Flight number 13, launched at the 13th minute of the 13th hour of the day, Houston time. What else could one expect 2 days into the flight when April 13th arrived but that something awful would happen? But while Apollo 13 was objectively a failed mission, it was something else altogether to the people who were involved in it. For Glynn Lunny, thinking back to the long development of flight operations that had begun with such halting steps in 1959, Apollo 13 was the crowning achievement, not just for the control center people, but for the people flying and all the people on the ground. It was crowning because it was ultimate. No crisis that manned spaceflight faced in the future could be much worse, Lunny thought, and still be survivable. We were as close as you could get to the edge and are still able to pull back. 1. The crisis on 13 began on the third evening of the flight. The command module Odyssey and the lunar module Aquarius were outward bound, 205,000 miles away from the Earth. Jim Lovell, veteran of 2 Gemini flights and Apollo 8, at that time the most experienced American astronaut, was commanding the flight. Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot, was making his first spaceflight, as was Jack Swigert, the command module pilot. Swigert was in a unique situation. As part of the backup crew for 13, he had been pressed into service just 3 days before launch when it was discovered that astronaut Charlie Duke, who had been working with the prime crew, had contracted German measles. Lovell and Hayes were immune, but the prime simp, Ken Mattingly, was not. Lovell fought to keep Mattingly on the crew even if he got the measles. They would be on the way home in Trans-Earth Coast when it happened, Lovell argued, and measles weren't that bad anyway. But Administrator Payne finally sided with the doctors and insisted that Swigert replace him. Mattingly did not, by the way, get the measles after all. Swigert had done well during the training that he and Lovell had packed in during the 2 days before launch, and he got along fine with Lovell and Hayes. Still, he was anxious to do his job just right. So far, the only problem had been getting good readings on the quantity of hydrogen left in one of his storage tanks. At 9 o'clock that night, Houston time, Lovell and the rest of the crew completed a television broadcast. None of the 3 networks had carried the show. By April 1970, flights to the moon were old hat, as were ill-lit pictures of whiskery astronauts floating around in their spacecraft. The main audience had been the people at MSC watching on the television monitors scattered around the center. In the Mocher, Flight Director Gene Kranz had permitted the O&P officer to throw the television image onto one of the screens on the front wall. With the spacecraft safely on course, the LEM docked with the command module and nothing much to do for 20 hours until LOI. This was one of the laziest shifts during a lunar flight. Seymour Cy Liebergott, a Californian, almost elderly by Mocher standards at the age of 34, was the white team's ECOM for 13. As the television show ended, he got onto the loop to flight to ask for a cryostir. Cryo referred to the cryogenics, 2 tanks each of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen that produced the spacecraft's electricity, oxygen supplies, and water. Chilled to their liquid state because that was the only way to store a sufficient amount for the lunar journey, the O2 and the H2, as the controllers referred to them, were fed into 3 fuel cells which converted them to electricity and, as a byproduct, drinking water. The electricity passed into 2 main electrical buses, A and B, from which the equipment on the spacecraft drew power. The system was so simple and so redundant that it seemed foolproof. Each of the 2 tanks of oxygen and hydrogen was adequate to last the entire mission if something were to happen to the other one. Any 2 of the 3 fuel cells could meet all the spacecraft's needs, and just one of them could bring the spacecraft home. There were 2 main buses, either one of which could, if necessary, distribute power to all the spacecraft's equipment. Each of these redundant systems had, almost perfectly, the best of both worlds. They were independent insofar as potential failures were concerned, but linked so that they could take over one another's duties. Piping, valving, wiring, everything was designed so that problems could be bypassed. Short of being hit by a meteoroid or something equally improbable, it was thought that the Apollo spacecraft could never run short of water, oxygen, or power. Liebergott had decided this would be a good time to help Swigert get a good quantity reading on the H2 tank that had been giving him problems. To do that, the astronauts would turn on 2 small fans in each of the 4 cryo tanks. The gases tended to settle into layers with different temperatures and densities, and stirring with the fans was necessary to produce the homogeneous tank temperature necessary for an accurate reading. It was a routine procedure that they ran once a day. Tonight's was an extra one prompted by the balky H2 tank. At 9:07 p.m., Capcom Jack Lausma passed the request for a cryostir to the crew. 3 men were working the shift in ECOM's back room. Dick Brown, the Electrical Power Systems, EPS specialist, George Bliss, an Environmental Control System, ECS specialist, and Larry Sheeks, another ECS specialist. It was not customary for the astronauts to tell the ground precisely when they flipped the switches that turned on the fans, so Liebergott and his 2 ECS men began watching the H2 quantities carefully as soon as the request was passed up. The numbers in question were located at the bottom right corner of a screen called CSM ECS Cryo Tab. At 9:08, the conversation on the ECOM loop, which until then had been quiet and desultory, suddenly changed. In the background on the air-to-ground loop, Swigert could be heard saying, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem." Immediately thereafter, Larry Sheeks cried out indignantly, "What's the matter with the data, ECOM? We got more'n a problem," chimed in Dick Brown. Liebergott himself was now looking at a second screen on his console called CSM EPS High Density, which showed the status of the electrical system. "Okay, listen you guys," Liebergott said to his back room. "We've lost fuel cell 1 and 2 pressure." George Bliss ran his eyes over the cryo screen and then reported the rest of it. He lost O2 tank 2 pressure and temperature. The crisis had begun. 1 minute. To the left of Liebergott and upper row was Gene Kranz. At 9:07, he and his white team were entering the last hour of their 8-hour shift. The conversation over the flight director's loop had been leisurely as he and guidance discussed whether to uplink some data into the onboard computer directly from the ground, or to read it off to the crew and let them enter the information themselves. Kranz was listening to someone else when Swigert said, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem." But he heard Guido Will Fenner report a few seconds later, "We've had a hardware restart. I don't know what it was." "Okay," said Kranz. "GNC, you want to look at it and see if you see any problems." A hardware restart indicated some unusual event that the computer had detected and was checking. Then Lovell's voice stopped Kranz short. "Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt." An undervolt meant a substantial reduction of power into bus B, jeopardizing the equipment running off it. Kranz went to his ECOM. "You see an AC bus undervolt there, ECOM?" negative flight. This was true. Liebergott had not seen the undervolt, but his answer was not entirely forthcoming. Liebergott was already looking at several other serious problems, and he wanted a few seconds to sort them out. Kranz persisted. I believe the crew reported it. Even as he spoke, Brown was telling Liebergott from the back room that he had seen an undervolt as well. Okay, flight, Liebergott amended. We've got some instrumentation problems. Let me add them up. Liebergott wasn't the only person who thought he had instrumentation problems. All around the Moker, controllers were seeing strange indications on their screens. INCO, the Instrumentation and Communication Systems Officer, formerly known as Telcom, reported to flight that the high-gain antenna had switched to high beam. Kranz, who was as baffled as everyone else by what was happening, told INCO to try to pin down the exact time of the change, hoping that it would give him some clues. Then GNC Buck Willoughby was on flight's loop, telling him that the spacecraft was changing attitude in unexpected ways. The helium valves on some of the RCS, reaction and control system jets that controlled the spacecraft's attitude were acting as if they were closed. They should be open. Kranz fielded this strange collection of problems, wondering what in the hell had happened up there. When Liebergott told Kranz that he would add up the instrumentation problems, he did not mention that he was also looking at a loss of pressure in 2 of the 3 fuel cells. This was true to flight controller custom. You didn't go to flight with a problem until you were reasonably confident that it was a problem. In this case, the probability that 2 independent fuel cells would go bad at the same moment had to be somewhere in the vicinity of 6 or 7 decimal places. They could, however, appear to go bad at the same time because of glitches in the electrical system, and that, Liebergott thought, was surely what had happened. At this point, Liebergott was assuming that the reading for O2 tank 2 pressure was another instrumentation problem caused by the same electrical difficulties that had produced the appearance of low fuel cell pressure. The tanks, metal spheres 26 inches in diameter, contained nothing but liquid oxygen and a few simple and reliable pieces of equipment, a heating element, 2 fans, and a few sensors. Nothing much could happen to them. And even if something had gone wrong with O2 tank 2, that still left O2 tank 1, which would automatically feed all 3 fuel cells and maintain full power, even if tank 2 quit working. If Liebergott wanted to treat the oxygen tank as the cause, he had to hypothesize a failure that A had disabled tank 2, B left tank 1 still functioning, but nonetheless C somehow disabled 2 fuel cells. That didn't make sense. The spacecraft wasn't built that way. It was doubtful that such a failure could even be simulated. What could a sim soup use as a cause? The alternative and much more plausible explanation was that Liebergott was seeing a problem in the electrical system. Perhaps it was a pure instrumentation phenomenon, and the readings were lying to him. Perhaps the problem was producing interference in the power flows, in which case they would find some way to bypass the errant circuitry. Liebergott's instrumentation theory was instantly reinforced. The main bus B undervolt warning light on his panel blinked off. Swigert reported the good news from Odyssey. The voltage was looking good. Still, he added, we had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there. Shortly thereafter, Lovell reported that the jolt must have rocked the sensor for the O2 quantity in tank 2. It had been down around 20%, but now was full-scale high again. And so it went for the first few minutes. Conflicting data, a stream of seemingly unrelated problems. Around the Moker and in the back rooms, controllers tried to put the pieces together, and they just didn't fit. 5 minutes. The difference between ECOM's situation and everyone else's was that the other guy's problems were fairly minor. ECOM's problems were either trivial, if it was bad instrumentation, or life-threatening, if the electrical and life support systems of the CSM were going dead. Like Bales on 11 and Aaron on 12, Liebergott was the man sitting out in the open, the man with the best opportunity to make the mistake that would, in another Moker euphemism, blow the whole mission. The difference between Liebergott's situation and Bales's in 11 or Aaron's in 12 was that Bales and Aaron had had the option of stopping everything immediately and coming home. Armstrong could have called off the landing. Conrad could have fired the escape tower. Liebergott was stuck. If it wasn't an instrumentation problem, this crisis had no easy way out. There might be no way out at all. Kranz inquired of Liebergott how things were going. Liebergott replied that the crew were flipping their fuel cells around, trying to reconfigure them. Kranz was impatient. Well, let's get some recommendation here, Si, if you got any better ideas. Just then, Swigert reported the inexplicable and disconcerting news that they were getting an undervolt on main bus A, the one that until now had still been working. Si, Kranz said, the exasperation in his voice now unmistakable. What do you want to do? Hold your own and... Kranz broke off to listen to the spacecraft, which was adding that main B was reading zip, distributing no power at all. Still nothing from Liebergott. Si, Kranz said, have you got a 6-sensor type problem there or what? Liebergott had been busy talking to his back room. He now came onto flight's loop and recommended that the crew try to reconnect the fuel cells that, Liebergott hoped, had been thrown offline by the mysterious jolt. Capcom passed the instruction up to the crew while Liebergott returned to the ECOM loop that connected him to his back room. Remembering that O2 pressure reading, Liebergott called to Sheeks. Larry, you don't believe that O2 tank 1 pressure, do you? Sheeks came back confidently. No, surge tank's good. Manifold's good. ECS is good. Reassured, Liebergott went back to the screens and to a discussion of the electrical problem with Dick Brown. Odyssey came back on the line. Okay, Houston, I tried to reset, and fuel cell 1 and 3 are both showing gray flags, but they are both showing zip on the flows. I copy flight, Liebergott said unhappily, indicating that he had heard the crew's transmission. This had to be an instrumentation problem. They couldn't possibly be having a simultaneous failure in 2 independent fuel cells, especially since, he had just been reassured, the oxygen was doing fine. And yet every time he got a new reading on the fuel cells, their condition seemed to be deteriorating. Okay, what do you want to do? Kranz asked. Liebergott suppressed an impulse to reply, I want to go home. He passed along a new configuration of link-ups between fuel cells and buses that would reveal this problem for what he hoped it was, some blown circuitry that they could work around. John Aaron was at home, shaving off the day's stubble after spending a long shift in the control center. Arnie Aldrich, chief of the CSM Systems branch, called on the phone from Span. John, there's something funny going on here, he said to Aaron. A lot of the guys think it's instrumentation problems and flaky readouts. Aldrich had a long cord on his phone, so Aaron asked him to walk along the rows of consoles and read him some data. Aaron would later realize that being away from the Moker, not glued to his own console, made it easier for him to see. In fact, standing in the quiet of his bedroom with shaving cream on his face, listening to the numbers that Aldrich reported, it was all quite clear. Arnie, that's not an instrumentation problem, he said to Aldrich. It's a real problem. Over in Building 45, Sid Jones, one of the MER's shift leaders, had been presiding over a half-empty MER when Swigert reported that Apollo 13 had a problem. It took him only a few minutes to decide that they were going to need all the help they could get. He called Don Arabian, who had left just an hour earlier, and some of the key systems people. Owen Morris, ASPO's chief of engineering for the lunar module, got back quickly. It was easy to see that people were upset by what was happening, but things hadn't settled down to the point that much was getting done. Morris called the LEM people up to his desk beside the dais and started handing out assignments. He was also on the phone with Beth Page. 10 minutes. Sitting in the back room pulling up screens, Dick Brown was beginning to wonder whether it was instrumentation after all. He called to the front room. Let's throw a battery on Bus B and Bus A until we psych it out, he said to Liebergott. We're getting undervolts. Brown's recommendation meant that the command module would be running off battery power. Liebergott suggested the less radical change of limiting the battery to Bus B and leaving the fuel cells on Bus A. I want to psych out what those fuel cells are doing here, Brown repeated. He confessed his growing fear. We might have a pressure problem in the fuel cells. It looks like 2 fuel cells simultaneously. That can't be, Liebergott protested. I can't believe that right off the bat, Brown agreed, but they're not feeding currents. John Aaron's performance on 12 crossed Liebergott's mind. Aaron had seen that unbelievable mess of parameters on his screen, and immediately he had come back to flight. Do this, do that, and everything had been straightened out in minutes. Seconds even. Liebergott felt as if it were taking him forever to figure this thing out. He was disappointed in himself and at the same time had a sense of being at the edge of an abyss. Liebergott pushed these thoughts to the back of his mind and, one hand clutching one of the metal handles to the electronics drawer in his console, began the first of a series of attempts over the next hour to resuscitate the electrical power. Occasionally, he had to remind himself to swallow. 12 minutes. Guido Will Fenner reported to Krantz that the spacecraft's attitude was still changing when it shouldn't be. He ought to stop it, Fenner told Krantz, he meaning the crew. Fenner was thinking about one of the perpetual concerns during the Apollo flights, gimbal lock. All of the spacecraft's course corrections, orbital insertions, and entry maneuvers depended on knowing not only precisely where the spacecraft was in space, but also the precise attitude of the spacecraft. Whenever the crew performed a maneuver, they had to know within fractions of degrees in which direction the nozzle of the engine was pointing. The guidance platform, encased within its 3 gimbals, provided that information. Unfortunately, there were certain circumstances under which the 3 gimbals could not perform their function of keeping the guidance platform steady. In particular, if the spacecraft were to get into a position where 2 of the 3 gimbals in the guidance system were lined up in the same plane, the gimbals would be unable to let the platform swing free. This was gimbal lock and would result in the platform losing its alignment, in effect becoming lost. A 4th gimbal would have taken care of the problem. No matter what crazy position the spacecraft got itself into, the platform would have remained steady as long as the guidance system remained powered up. Gemini had used a 4-gimbal system, but a 4th gimbal would have been heavy. It would have added substantially to the bulk of the system because it would have had to fit around the other 3, and the instrumentation lab at MIT, which designed the system, was comfortable with 3 gimbals. That's what the lab had used for Polaris. 3 gimbals were enough for any maneuver the spacecraft might be required to make, as long as everyone paid attention to what was happening. After a long battle with the astronauts, Jim McDivitt threatened not to fly in a spacecraft without a 4th gimbal. A 3-gimbal system was used. In the event that the spacecraft did accidentally go into gimbal lock, it would be possible to realign a platform from scratch. But, as on Apollo 12, it was a complicated, tedious job. And most certainly, Fenner wanted to avoid gimbal lock with a spacecraft that already seemed to have more problems than it could handle. Now, he was warning Krantz that the spacecraft was moving unpredictably. Pushed by an unidentified force, Odyssey was vulnerable to gimbal lock. 14 minutes. Lovell reported seeing something venting from the service module, a gas of some sort. He didn't say so, but in his own mind he was pretty sure it was oxygen. The O2 tank 2 pressure was reading 0, and there was a big sheet of what looked like white smoke out his window. It added up. He was also pretty sure that it was only a matter of time until the CSM went dead. For Lovell, the moment when he looked out the window and saw the venting was the moment when he stopped being disappointed at losing the lunar landing and started wondering how they were going to get home. For Capcom Jack Lausma, a fellow astronaut, Lovell's report of venting was the most chilling moment of the flight. The problem could not be just instrumentation or an electrical screw-up. Something violent and destructive had happened to the service module more than 200,000 miles away from home. Krantz understood the implications too, and knew that everyone else in the room had heard Lovell's calm report. He decided it was time to give a little speech to the controllers. "Okay, now, let's everybody keep cool," he began. "We got the LEM still attached. The LEM spacecraft's good. So if we need to get back home, we got a LEM to do a good portion of it with." He went through the priorities. Don't blow the command module's internal batteries. Don't do anything to blow the remaining main bus. Let's solve the problem, he concluded, but let's not make it any worse by guessing. Krantz spit out the word as if it were an epithet. A few seconds after Krantz had finished, Brown called Liebergott on the ECOM loop. He sounded curiously formal, but that was because he had something momentous to say. "ECOM, this is EPS. I think we ought to start powering down." Powering down meant that they would start taking some equipment offline, making it temporarily inaccessible to the crew. It was not something one did to a spacecraft in flight unless there was a compelling reason, but Liebergott immediately agreed. He had been coming to the same conclusion independently. "Let's get the power down list here," Brown said. For the first time that night, Brown's voice shook. During the next minute, the only sound on the ECOM loop was the rustle of pages as each of them looked through his copy of the emergency power down checklist. It was then that Liebergott looked up at his screen and suffered yet another shock. The pressure on his other O2 tank was falling. In preparing for disasters during flight, the world of flight control began with certain verities. One was that structural materials like lines and bulkheads had a reliability not just of 0.9999 or even 0.999999, but of 1. Most of them had margins that protected them well beyond the worst-case design requirements. A second verity was that while 2 of the mechanisms of the spacecraft might plausibly fail simultaneously, it was not plausible that 2 redundant elements within the same system would fail simultaneously. This confidence was based on simple mathematics. With thousands of parts in the spacecraft, even very small probabilities of failure in the individual components added up to a reasonably large probability that some 2 of those thousands of mechanisms would fail at the same time. But if there are 2 completely independent oxygen tanks, and each of them has a reliability of 0.9999, for example, then the chance that both of the oxygen tanks will fail is 0.0001 squared, or 1 in 100 million. The likelihood of a dual failure within any of the handful of major systems, electrical, oxygen, water, propulsion, and the like, was therefore exceedingly small. Until the moment that he saw the pressure on O2 Tank 1 falling, Liebergott, if he believed his unbelievable screens, had been looking at a double failure in the fuel cells plus an oxygen tank failure. Now, if he accepted the newest information before him, he was confronted with a quadruple failure, a pair of double failures within systems. As Swigert would write later, if somebody had thrown that at us in the simulator, we have said, "Come on, you're not being realistic." Around the corner from the Moker, in Span, Scott Simpkinson watched the data with growing concern. Like everyone else, he had been hoping that it was an instrumentation problem. Now someone told him that the pressure in the second O2 tank was dropping. At that point, he said later, we began to get everybody in the world working on it. 18 minutes. Kranz had just finished warning the crew through Capcom to maneuver out of a new threat of gimbal lock when ECOM got back to flight with his recommendation. "Flight," Liebergott cleared his throat nervously. "I think the best thing we can do right now is start a power down." Kranz tried to make the best of it. "You want to power down? Let us look at the TM, telemetry, and all that good stuff, and then come back up, power up again." That's right, Liebergott played along. They could still hope that this was something to be explained and fixed. Chris Kraft, recently promoted to deputy director of MSC, was in the shower when he got a call from George Abbey. Kraft dressed without taking time to dry himself and drove to MSC at speeds up to 90 miles per hour. He walked into the Moker and over to Kranz's console. Kranz glanced up at the man he called teacher. "We are in deep shit," he said. 32 minutes. Capcom Jack Lausma, feeling a little apologetic that the Moker didn't seem to be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat tonight, called up to the crew. 13, he said. "We've got lots and lots of people working on this. We'll get you some dope as soon as we have it, and you'll be the first to know." There was a pause of several seconds, and then back from Odyssey came Jim Lovell's voice, as dry as the 200,000 miles of vacuum it had crossed. "Oh, thank you." It was classy, it was cool, and it reminded his listeners, this episode might be a strain on you folks in the Moker, and that's too bad, but 3 of us up here have a unique interest in how it all comes out. As for Kranz, a strange change in his style was taking place. During the first few minutes after the problem was reported, he had been brusque, even querulous, as people were slow to explain to him what was going on. His little speech to the controllers had been intended to reassure, but his delivery had had a hard edge to it. Now, as the crisis deepened, his tone was getting more and more casual, sometimes almost gentle, as he went from one controller's problems to another's. John Aaron arrived at the control center. He walked slowly through the Moker and the back rooms, stopping periodically to plug in at the consoles. You can visualize what had happened, he reminisced. Everyone was glued to his own tube, and he was digging into his own area deeper and deeper and deeper. Their disbelief in what was happening, Aaron thought, was induced to some degree by their training. The Sim Soup's favorite trick was to confuse the controllers with instrumentation problems, and then, while you were off chasing the flaky readouts, they would drop the hammer on you with some real big failure and see how well you could back out of that. The simulations always had a way out. Surely this situation must have a way out as well. To Aaron, it was as if the controllers were saying, "We're not going to give up. We're not going to give up. We can't give up. We've never had this happen before." He began preaching to them in his Oklahoma twang. "You guys are wasting your time," he said to them. "You're convincing yourself this is some kind of funny instrumentation problem. You really need to understand that the CSM is dying." 38 minutes. Liebergott watched the pressure in his remaining O2 tank slowly fall. George Bliss called from the back room to tell him that now the pressure in the surge tank was falling as well. The CSM's systems had automatically tapped into it to try to make up for the deficits elsewhere. This was not permissible. The surge tank was a small bottle of gaseous oxygen on board the command module that was normally used for entry. Ordinarily, it could be refilled any time by one of the O2 tanks. But if they were gone, the surge tank had to be preserved at all costs. Liebergott called Kranz, asking him to instruct the crew to isolate the surge tank. Kranz was still focused on trying to save as much of the mission as he could, which at this point meant trying to restore pressure in O2 Tank 1 and keep at least one fuel cell working. "By that," he said sharply, "I don't understand that, Si. If you wanted to keep the fuel cell going, why pull off one source of oxygen?" "We want to save the surge tank, which we will need for entry," said Liebergott. There was a brief pause. "Okay, I'm with you. Kranz's voice was resigned. "Capcom, let's also isolate the surge tank." The term for what Kranz had been doing since he had heard about the anomaly was downmoding, moving from one set of options to another more restricted set. As he did so, he was trying to disturb the standard configurations as little as possible. Kranz, like Kraft, had formulated some precepts of flight control, and one of his favorites was, "Tread lightly, lest ye step in shit." He had been trying, he recalled, to move very easily and progressively through this thing, because you did not want to close out any of your options for any of the systems, because you never knew which ones you were going to get. At this point, the options were dwindling to a precarious handful. 42 minutes. In an attempt to keep O2 Tank 1 alive, Liebergott instructed Odyssey to use manual heaters to increase the pressure. The heater started, and Liebergott watched the pressure reading. It should have been going up as the heat was applied. It wasn't. He called Dick Brown, who was watching the same screen in the back room. "EPS, ECOM, it looks grim." "Yes, it does," Brown replied. "We got the 5 amps of power to heat the heaters, and no pressure increase. Just went down." Liebergott sighed. "It's going down," he told Brown. "We're losing it." Liebergott called flight and asked that the crew turn on the fans in O2 Tank 1. That didn't help either. The pressure continued to fall. 46 minutes. "Flight ECOM, go ahead. The pressure in O2 Tank 1 is all the way down to 297. You better think about getting in the LEM and using the LEM systems. I'm going to have to power way down. I don't know if I'm going to be able to save the O2 for the remaining fuel cell." Liebergott, like Aaron, now knew that the command module was dying. If that was true, the only way the crew could get back was by getting into the LEM and surviving on its oxygen, water, and power. Kranz pushed a little. The heaters weren't working, perhaps. Maybe there were some circuit breakers to be checked, some way to get those heaters going and bring up the O2 pressure, some way to supply oxygen to the fuel cell. "We saw the current," Liebergott said bleakly, but Kranz persisted, so Liebergott gave him some circuit breakers to check on panel 226. Kranz was determined to try every possibility, but he was not oblivious to what Liebergott was telling him. A minute later, Kranz called Telmu with a brief message. "I want you to get some guys figuring out minimum power in the LEM to sustain life." In the middle of the warm Houston night, the cars began pulling into the empty parking lots outside buildings 45 and 30. They wheeled across the lots, heedless of signs and painted arrows. Occasionally, rubber squealed as someone braked abruptly into a space. When they got out, the drivers half ran, calling to each other with hurried exchanges of whatever fragmentary information they had. Ed Fendel, now an Inco, was one of them. He had been chatting with Jerry Griffin over a beer after their softball game when he got a call from the Inco on duty. By the time he arrived, the lots were already filling up. To hell with that, Fendel thought. There was an open spot right next to Building 30. In his rush, he locked his keys in the car, which sat there for the next 5 days, in the space clearly marked as reserved for the Director of Flight Operations. 51 minutes. Sigh, George Bliss told Liebergott from the back room. It looks like from the leak rate that we've got 1 hour and 54 minutes left until we're down to 100 psi in Tank 1, which is about the end of it for the fuel cells. As often happened, Flight was asking a question while a controller was talking to the back room. In this instance, Kranz was saying, I see the juice is still going down there, Ecom. You got any more suggestions? Liebergott hadn't heard. He called Flight to pass along Bliss's bad news. Flight, Ecom. Kranz repeated his question. Any more suggestions in trying to pump up O2 Tank 1 pressure? Throughout the crisis, Liebergott had been reasonably successful in suppressing his emotions, keeping his voice businesslike. For one moment, in one word, his unhappiness showed. No, Liebergott said miserably, a brief wail. Then his voice was back to normal. Flight, we're going to hit 100 psi in 1 hour and 54 minutes. That's the end right there. In less than 2 hours, the command module would be lifeless, Kranz acknowledged. 54 minutes. In span, Scott Simpkinson was puzzling over the loss of oxygen. One last possibility occurred to him. It involved a radical cure, but this was a radical problem. He got himself patched through to talk with Liebergott. Hey, did we close the reactant valves on those 2 fuel cells that's down? Simpkinson asked. We could be losing cryo through there. There was one reactant valve leading into each fuel cell. Simpkinson was pointing out a source of leakage that Liebergott hadn't considered. But the solution, closing the reactant valve, was final. Once its reactant valve had been closed, a fuel cell could not be reactivated. Still, it was a new idea. Liebergott broached it to Brown, who was dubious. I'm not sure this problem's not back up in the tank somewhere, he said. And if we can get that O2 straightened out, it might straighten out the... Liebergott interrupted. I don't think we're going to get it straightened out, Dick. I don't either, Brown finally answered. There was a long silence. And then, for the first time since they had been thrown into the middle of this mystery, they began to see how it might have happened. There's a possibility that there could be a leak between that reactant valve and the rate sensor, Brown conceded. If there is, then shutting it off may help us. But that'd be a dual failure, not a single failure. And a dual failure still seemed as improbable to both of them as it ever had. Ecom pondered that for a moment. Finally, Liebergott said, it'd have to be in the cryo tanks for them both fuel cells, to go. Somewhere back there, Brown agreed. But still, that left the problem of explaining why both O2 tanks were failing. Then the nickel dropped. Yeah, that's right, it's common, Liebergott said excitedly. Dick, if you blasted a hole downstream between the rate transducer and the reactant valve, that'd be that... Liebergott could barely get the words out. It suddenly seemed so obvious. That's manifold right there, all 3 cells. He was very close to the truth. At that same moment, Kranz was on the loop with Fido. The spacecraft was rapidly nearing the outer limits of the time at which it could perform a direct abort, returning to Earth without first looping around the moon. But a direct abort meant using the SPS engine on a very sick service module. Kranz told Fido to concentrate exclusively on returns around the moon, using the LEMS engines. Unless we get a heck of a lot smarter, I think we are wasting our time planning on using the SPS. Arabian had arrived at the Mir about half an hour after the problem had first been reported. It was at times like this, one observer reflected, that Mad Dawn was at his best. Arabian's extravagances were muted, but his quickness and insightfulness remained. Also, he didn't have any trouble making up his mind under pressure. He is very decisive, the observer said, and when you're under a lot of stress, that's very helpful. Arabian began by pulling the power people and thermal people up to the blackboard, where they mapped out the minimum voltages under which different pieces of Odyssey's equipment could operate. After half an hour, they had worked up a basic configuration. Arabian didn't wait for it to get written down. He and a few of his team trotted over to Building 30 to talk to the FOD people themselves. 69 minutes. The crew had closed the reactant valve on fuel cell 3, and it hadn't helped, nor had Liebergott and Brown really expected it to. They were now increasingly convinced that something drastic had happened to the manifold leading into all three cells. The time was 10:17. Kranz had just informed all the controllers that they should begin to hand over to Glyn Lunny's black team. Liebergott stood up shakily from the console to turn it over to Clint Burton. It had been a long time since he had last told himself to swallow, and he found he could barely talk. "I was so relieved to be relieved," he would say many years later, when he was finally able to smile about it.
And that was Apollo, Chapter 27, Part 1, or Section 1. And that's Apollo by Charles Murray and Catherine Bly Cox. Next Wednesday, Section 2. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.